Begin. Order. Welcome to today's session of the Business and Trade Committee as we begin looking deeper into consumer affairs ahead of our confirmation hearings for the new chair of the Competition and Market Authority, scheduled to take place in front of this committee on the 24th of February. Thank you very much indeed to our witnesses for joining us. And perhaps I could just kick off with you. Why is everything so expensive now? I mean, let me just show you on the slide that we have just put together ahead of this hearing. I mean, for most of us on the committee, our constituents tell us that the spiralling cost of living is like the number one issue. And so as we pull together just evidence on a basket of goods, whether it's margarine, milk, chicken, bread, lager, potatoes, I mean, up to 56% increases in these prices, 48% increase in the price of milk. I mean, what is going on? What's your view?
I mean, that's a really big question, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the price of everything from your groceries, your energy, your water, your telecoms, everything's going up, and it seems like on a sort of weekly basis. I think energy prices played a big part in a lot of this, particularly over the last couple of years, sort of kicking off with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which sort of saw energy prices spiral overnight and have sort of started to come down, but have taken a fair bit of time on that front. We also then saw huge inflationary pressures, which again have sort of subsided a bit, but those prices kind of keep on creeping up. Cost of labour, there's lots of trends, but I think where we are is that for many of the people, citizens advice reports, certainly we see huge pressures in the cost of living across that. In terms of our debt clients, around 50% of those are now in what we call a negative budget, where their
what does that mean?
Where their income is lower than the cost of all of their essential bills. So even once you've stripped out any luxuries, by the time you've paid your sort of rent, your utility bills, your council tax, their income is gone and more. And I think sort of what I'd also say is those problems are becoming more entrenched and complex. So the average debt of people who come to us for help is also growing significantly. So month after month, their debts are increasing. And the complexity of the problems we see is also increasing. So now, on average, people who come to us for help have an average of more than 5 issues each. So kind of it's not that, people are struggling in one area of their lives, they're struggling across the board, and that's a real challenge for us as an organisation in supporting them. We do our best and we do great work, but there's only so much you can do if someone's income is...
So we all remember when inflation hit 11%, and now it's come down to about 3.4%, which is what it was in December. But food price inflation was actually about a third higher than that. Food price inflation in December was about 4.5%. So these headline inflation figures, they don't actually mean much to people anymore, do they? Because the real kind of inflation that they're experiencing is actually much higher than the headline rate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think those sort of big numbers of like overall inflation and fractions of a percentage of GDPR here and there really don't mean a lot to people when they can't sort of afford the cost of their essentials. And that is like really confusing and difficult for people. Is definitely something we see through our services for sure.
Okay, so Ms. Concha, you're at Which. I mean, what's the perspective from Which on just like why is everything so expensive now? And these headline figures for inflation, do they mean anything for people? They don't seem to reflect the reality of life for our constituents, that's for sure.
Yeah, so as Anne was saying, a lot of this is input, driven by increases in input costs, labor, energy, and this is reflected in food prices. And when people go to the supermarket, they are seeing increases in prices. But also, there is an issue here about failings in competition and consumer protection in relation to regulation and enforcement. So if you look, for example, areas like veterinary services, for example.
Or fuel prices.
Or fuel prices. But in the case, for example, on vet, which was an investigation by the CMA, you saw there was quite a lot of egregious practices, exploitative practices, and by some of vet providers. The same thing about secondary ticketing. This is both lack of appropriate regulation, but also in some areas also a lack of enforcement. We are seeing quite a lot of problems in pricing issues across sectors, like for example, fake sales that tell you that it was this price and now is this price, using misleading reference price, and we are seeing it across a number of sectors, and that is illegal, by the way. And the problem there is a lack of enforcement.
So let me just get this straight then. So we're saying that rising food prices are really increasing pressure on families right now, but you're saying that a breakdown in regulation and enforcement is making the problem worse.
Yeah. In some sectors, definitely is the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
John David, anything to add to this kind of picture of why everything is just so expensive?
Yes, and obviously cost of living is on everybody's sort of mind at the moment, at the forefront, and we're in broad agreement in the sense of those input factors that which you've just talked about, and whether that's your geopolitical sort of instability and energy prices, gas, oil, those sorts of things. You've also got the production cost of raw materials; they're all sort of going up. And other things like weather instability as well, in terms of impact on prices of things like simple as coffee, as well as those other factors in terms of inflation relative to wage growth. So those are all sort of factors. And the point that also came out is it's actually impacting on everyday essentials in terms of food, but also other things that people would regard as essentials in terms of buying a car or sort of having sort of transportation, those sorts of things. So I think it's across every layer. That's the problem, and that's why it's sort of so pernicious at the moment. In terms of more relative to our world directly of trading standards, I think that one is we'd look at supply chain in terms of, because of all the factors I've just outlined, in terms of businesses are incurring more costs and they're just passing those on to the consumers, legitimately or not, as the case may be. And then the last point, which I would sort of reaffirm, which is about that inability to always ensure a level playing field for consumers. And that's down to sort of market surveillance, enforcement activity, and also legislation, although that sort of legislation is sort of catching up at the moment.
So you'd say that there's sharp practice in the marketplace, which regulators are failing to stop. That is adding to the pressure on families.
Absolutely adds to it, and we've seen examples that have been mentioned already around sort of the veterinary practices, pricing, secondary ticketing. So there are sort of concrete examples out there of things that shouldn't be happening but are happening. And then if I just specifically relate that to the world of sort of trading standards, has had a real-time cut actually over the last sort of 10-15 years of about 39% in funding at the local authority level. And then when you look at trading standards relative to, let's say, other regulatory enforcement like environmental health, trading standards has been hit twice as hard. So you've got a depletion in capacity at the local level, and actually the local marketplace is really important. So there's a lot of stuff happens that's really good that the CMA will investigate at the national level, but also it's about the high street and making sure that the high street is a level playing field as well.
Yeah.
And that's where we need to be able to do more enforcement.
So as we were researching for this session, I think one of the things that shocked us is that the hit to consumers isn't just higher prices. There's now this wide range of harms that actually cost Britain's consumers £71 billion a year. And that is everything from poor quality goods that you can't get a refund for, subscriptions that you can't cancel, deliveries that don't turn up, stuff that is just unsafe, and services that you pay for but which never materialise. I mean, £71 billion, that's thousands of pounds for every house in the country, on top of these kinds of increases in prices. So tell us from the which point of view, what is going on here?
So some of these sectors like that you mentioned there, some of them are regulated, but actually enforcement is lacking. So I think that we are finding, we have the DMCC Act that make a big important step, giving the right powers, for example, to the CMA to enforce consumer protection. And the CMA in November announced the first investigations in key areas. Then we have trading standards that John was saying there is a challenge there. I think that you are in charge of enforcing more than 200 pieces of legislation.
About 300 pieces, yeah.
Which is impossible with the resources that they currently have. But one thing that I want to stress is this is not only about resources, it's also about the structure of enforcement, in particular on trading standards. So, for example, you have a situation at the moment where you don't have national regulators or the government, the departments that actually fund trading standards. They don't have the data on how many trading standards officers are in each local authority, what they are prioritizing in their local areas, what actions are they taking, what are the issues that they are seeing and they are tackling, and issues that they are seeing that are unable to tackle. So you don't have a national picture for the regulators to say, okay, we are seeing this particular thing that local authorities are facing that actually should be at the national regulator to enforce, for example.
I just want to get this straight. So the cost of living is the number one issue for most people, certainly in our constituencies. Second, we've got these price rises that are going through the roof. Third, we've got £71 billion worth of extra costs on consumers through a whole host of breakdowns in the marketplace. I mean, John, is that basically what is going on?
Yeah, and so your point around the £71 billion of consumer detriment, that was up from £54 billion 3 years ago. And I know that some of the way the figures were calculated have changed, but if you went back to 2014, 2015, it was running at about £25 billion. So in terms, there's been an exponential...
They've tripled.
Yeah, well, yes, in terms of... And so that's part of the challenge. And then, whilst I can't make a causal link, in terms of the decline in sort of, let's say, trading standards, we sort of can compare the two and sort of see a sort of an impact across both. I think what I'd also point out is that, so we're talking about consumer detriment and financial detriment. You sort of alluded to the point earlier, which is also the broader risk that consumers face. And so it's not just the financial detriment, there is also the harm, physical harm, because there are goods that and products that people can buy. I'm sure we'll talk about online marketplaces sort of separately, but there are products out there that will and do hurt, harm and kill people. And so there's a safety element to this as well, which makes this a really pressing issue. So enforcement isn't just about making a reduction in the 71 billion. That has to be a target, I think, for government over the next sort of 3 years by the time the next survey comes out from the CMA. But it's also about looking at those safety issues to make sure that consumers are absolutely well protected and they can trust the system, because at the moment they probably trust the system a little bit too much.
Okay, so have we basically got this picture straight now about what Britain's consumers are going through, and anything you want to add to that portrait of doom I've just sketched?
Certainly is a bit of a portrait of doom, isn't it? So I think Citizens Advice runs the National Consumer Service, which is a free helpline for people to call for advice about their consumer problems. And the sort of two areas where we receive most calls is around used cars and home improvement. So last year we got 57,000 calls from people about the used car market and 38,000 around home improvements. We've also sort of previously highlighted issues around sort of smaller markets but are really important to the people who use them. So, for example, disability aids. But what really kind of unifies these markets is the fact that they are very lightly regulated. So you don't have a sector regulator. So I mean, trading standards, I think, do a good job with the resources that they have, but it's just not. It feels like a bit of a wild west out there for people in those sectors. So something we're thinking about at Citizens Advice is whether you can't fully regulate all of these markets, that's probably not the answer, but whether there's kind of like a midway point that you could take between this sort of wild west that we have and full regulation. And I think within that, we need to think about tackling some of the most common issues. So often it's around identifying quality and legitimate traders. So could we have some kind of a registered or licensing for traders in those sectors? The quality of the products and work being delivered. And I think part of that is around advice. So people are kind of clued up on their rights and what to look out for, but is also part of that standards and enforcement piece. And then I think finally, alternative dispute resolution. So in regulated sectors, we've got ombudsman, just to make sure that when people have a complaint, at the moment it's just kind of they go to the trader, they go, yeah, no, not interested, and that's about it. So that's something we're quite interested in at Citizens Advice what are the features of kind of those markets where we can get rid of some of those risks in high-risk markets without resorting to full
Let's get
regulation.
into the way that we enforce competition in some of these markets. Charlie Maynard.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm interested in to what extent market concentration is having a impact on a lack of competition, particularly in, say, the food markets, but I'm interested in other markets, you might say. I mean, in the supermarket sector, I think the top 4 have got something like 2/3 of the market. The top 6 have got 80% of the market. I think the CMA has looked into it and basically was like, looks fine to us. Do you share their view, or is that an unfair framing of their view? Anybody who'd like to give comments on that?
I think that if you look at supermarkets and competition in supermarkets, I think that it will be fair to say that it's definitely healthy competition. I think it's when you look at particular products where you may find issues, and I think that one of the things that the CMA looked, for example, was a baby formula, for example. So I think that you need to look at particular products. I will say that there are other markets where actually they look that there is competition, but there isn't. And one example of this, again, that the CMA looked was veterinary services. You may be in your high street have like 3 vets, but actually with different names that may owned by the same company. So that is no proper competition. And the problem with that is not only that there is no competition, but also the consumers think that they are, and they think that they are shopping around and they're getting a good deal, and therefore they don't need to continue shopping around. So which is quite misleading. So in some sectors there is definitely an issue of lack of competition.
And to what extent do you think, whether it's the CMA or any other bodies, are actually covering the pitch and actually getting around, because there seems to be remarkably few, there seems to be some very long, big, slow studies, but there's very little kind of fast-footed, quick studies into that market or that sub-market or that sub-market, and therefore, essentially, the consumer, the person on the street, is potentially getting whacked, and I don't get much appetite by the CMA to be going after all these things, and it's like, oh no, let's stay kind of really slow and heavy, as opposed to being fast and nimble and covering a lot of ground, and that worries me.
Well, it worries us as well, and we would like to see more of these studies. But actually, when you look at what is happening over the last few months, there is definitely political pressure on regulators to be careful about regulation and enforcing regulation. So in a way, it may not be surprising that regulators are being a little bit more careful and unnecessarily careful, we will say, on consumer protection and competition policy in taking action in some markets, because they are not being encouraged by the government to take action. Actually, they are being encouraged to be careful about upsetting businesses.
Please continue.
I mean, I completely agree. And what spooks me is that the Labour government is saying, hey, we're really pro-business, and we're pro-growth. And you're like, well, actually, if you're serious about pro-growth, you want to have a strong, competitive, fair market. And therefore, you need to have the CMA going like the clappers round all those markets and whacking people who are cheating. And my vibe on the Labour government is they're doing the opposite. They're saying, hey, big players, come and eat our market alive, sit on top of it, and drown out all the little competitors who are the innovators. And it seems like they've got competition completely backwards. Is that an unfair framing?
Well, I mean, as I said, I actually think that when this government think about growth, I agree with you. An enabler for growth is competition. I'm an economist. That is a fact. Enabler for growth. Then, when you think about growth, you not only look at the supply side, you also look at the demand side. And if you have a demand side that feels that they cannot trust markets because they are going to be ripped off, there is no hope for that demand to try new services, to try this innovation. You may get some that will try that, but you will never get the right potential. So from my perspective, I agree with you. Competition as an enabler and actually well-designed, evidence-based consumer protection are also an enabler for growth.
David, John, I mean, what's your perspective on this question about whether we're allowing competition to be vigorous enough to bring down prices?
So I think I agree with the points being made in terms of I think it's different for different sectors. And I think that's absolutely the key, is understanding which sectors have healthy competition, like supermarkets probably, and which ones don't, like veterinary services. And it's how do you get underneath that so you understand what the issues are. And I think that sort of partly goes to the heart of the question, which is how do you know? And then that comes down to intelligence, the role of citizens advice, consumer redress, so that consumers can actually report stuff when they feel that actually they haven't got a fair deal or something that's faulty or not working.
Who do they ring, John?
Well, they would ring citizens advice in terms of their the consumer advice service. Now, there are challenges right now. I would fully support sort of more funding into citizens advice, because I think there needs to be better mechanisms for consumer redress so that somebody can make a complaint. Because then what happens is that feeds into citizens advice. They will collate. They used to sit in trading standards, by the way, but then sort of a number of years ago it sort of moved across because there was a postcode lottery, so it moved across for the right reasons.
But do you think the CMA, I mean, just to Mr. Maynard's point, do you think the CMA is monitoring prices closely enough and then acting quickly and vigorously enough? Because certainly I remember during the early days of COVID when I was calling in the way people were hiking cow poll prices, for example, and this appeared to be complete news to the CMA.
Yeah, I think they're becoming more aware. Coming back to my point about sort of intelligence, because it's how do you gather the intelligence from consumers the day-to-day saying those sorts of issues, and how do they then get fed back into trading standards? Trading standards work very closely with the CMA in terms of providing intelligence around market issues.
But if there's no trading standards inspectors left...
So this is my point I was coming to. So you've made my point for me in that respect, which is that if you can't do enough market surveillance, then you won't have the intelligence, so you can't make the informed decisions as to where you need to go with the market investigations.
Dan Aldridge.
I'm just going to follow up on that first, if that's okay. So there was something that you mentioned about looking at the specific products, and in my constituency, Western-super-Mare, drivers are currently paying kind of 9 pence more per litre than just 30 minutes up the road in Bristol. The government yesterday launched the transparency tool. I'm interested in the perspectives of the panel, just in terms of if they think that is actually going to drive competition in any way. Is it going to be effective? Is it going to drive the change that we want to see for consumers in places like Western?
Well, I think that is a measure that we support, because that gives you transparency. If you want competition to work, you need to make sure that consumers have easy access to prices. So by having that data and encouraging companies to use that data to help you to compare prices, it should help. Is that data is provided on time with all the there is quite a lot of guidance on when they need to update the data and all of this. So I think that could be a very good step. We will have to see how it works in practice.
Yeah. Anybody else got anything on that?
I think I agree with all of that. Definitely, transparency very good. I think the slight issue with those kind of tools is petrol and where people need it is quite locally based. So it's sort of it can help you to save a little bit of money within your local area. I guess it depends how far you want to drive to kind of get that lower based petrol. So it's also about giving people access to information that's kind of most relevant to them and kind of allows them to make that choice. But if all of the ones within that area are higher than outside of your constituency, then perhaps that's kind of less helpful. So you also need those kind of market studies from CMA and others to kind of make sure that the market as a whole is delivering competition.
I mean, it drives me insane that that is the case, and it feels very punitive. But sorry, John, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perennial, isn't it? I think what we've particularly noticed that people in hard times, people care about prices. They care about the display of prices, the communication of prices. But people care about petrol prices in good times as well as hard times. So there's a sort of double whammy going on there. Like the rest of the panel, we support this initiative, and it's certainly not a bad thing. And how effective it's going to be, we're going to have to wait and see. I think ultimately it seems to us that some of these things, the petrol sector, the grocery sector as well, that was raised earlier in terms of are there enough supermarkets, is there enough competition in that sector? Ultimately, that comes down to competition law, really, more than the sort of consumer protection stuff that we deal with, and that is a CMA only thing. That's not something we get directly involved in. We're very interested in everything around the contribution of consumer protection to effective competition. Obviously, we're involved in that directly. But when it comes to these pure competition issues, they're harder to deal with, and they are really without wanting to pass the buck, they are for the CMA, really.
But this problem of unit pricing is significant, isn't it? I mean, when I was shopping for Mrs. Burns' roast on Sunday, there was no unit pricing on any of the meat in the local Tesco's. And so, I mean, who's responsible for making sure that there is proper unit pricing displayed so that shoppers can actually understand what's good value and what isn't?
Well, the easy answer to that one, it's the local trade and standards department have the responsibility for that. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the way it tends to work most of the time nowadays with big organisations like that is they will have a primary authority, which is usually the local authority closest to the head office of the big organisation, and they will advise them on how to set up their system so that they're complying with everything. But in terms of that local individual enforcement, it's the people local to the shop. Now, the priorities, I mean, I think a theme from us today is going to be about all you're talking about the 300 pieces of legislation, all the pressures that are on local authority departments that will have literally a handful of officers.
Tesco's makes £4 billion profit a year, and if
yes,
they can't
they
get
should be
unit
absolutely
pricing on meat right, then something's going wrong.
Absolutely. And the local trade and standards might not be prioritising that as an issue because they've got to do vapes and they've got to do all these other things that are urgent and have to be dealt with that day, sort of thing. So it's back to the earlier theme, I think, about some failings in the whole regulatory landscape in terms of the way we've got it set up at the moment, frankly.
Do you want to comment?
So the issue of Tesco that you mentioned there, I mean, that is the issue that we are facing with the current structure of the regime. So you have a local standard responsibility and say, there is no unit price, but you don't know if actually another official in other local authority are looking at the same problem. And we are talking about Tesco, a major retailer. Should be the responsibility of local authorities actually to hold Tesco to account, or should actually be for the national regulator to hold them to account with the intelligence that you can get, at local level or at the regional level. So at the moment we have, for example, a local authority that is in charge of Amazon. A local authority.
I mean, that's obviously crazy.
Exactly. So, I think that we need to take a very serious look at what trading standards is being asked to do, and because I think at the moment the world have evolved in a way that it doesn't make sense as it is at the moment. And actually, as I said before, government doesn't really have a full picture of what is happening. They don't know. They don't have the data. So it's impossible for someone to say, okay, well, there is something happening here in Tesco and here there, and then say the CMA say, well, actually, let's do an investigation about Tesco, why Tesco is not complying with the law. That conversation cannot happen.
We're
because
blind,
there is no data.
basically.
Sorry?
So we're blind.
Yeah, there is no accountability.
Yeah, Mr. MacKenzie.
Just to come back in on that specific example that you had there, you see the local trade standards probably won't know about that, and it won't get reported to them. They're not doing routine visits like we did 20, 30 years ago because they're just nowhere near the resources to do those types of cyclical routine visits. So it's just not known about, So it ties in with the earlier point about the 71 billion, which we think is a significant underestimate, but is a useful comparative figure to compare with figures that have been worked out the same way in the past. But there's a serious under-reporting of all these things. People don't know where to go. They don't know who to speak to,
Mr. Woodridge, I interrupted your line of questioning.
No, it's fine. I think I got the stuff I wanted on the petrol stuff. I think the thing that is front and centre of many of our minds as constituency MPs is how what the main challenges are facing by families and individuals on low incomes, and we talk about the poverty premium, but how can the poverty premium be reduced? What other levers should the government and retailers be using to make life a bit easier, if possible, when it comes to the cost of living?
And do you want to kick off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said, and we sort of talked a bit in the first question is, I mean, affordability is top of families' minds at the moment, and they're being hit by price rises left, right, and centre across all of their essentials. I mean, we saw water go up by more than inflation just last week. We still see mid-contract price rises in the telecom sector. There's some sort of unfair practices there, but also just the sheer weight of that. I think the solutions to it are quite challenging. I mean, fundamentally, the balance sheet isn't working. People's incomes aren't matching their essential outgoings. I think so. One thing that we've been looking at Citizens Advice and pushing for quite a long time is improved social tariffs across essential markets. So within energy, water, and broadband in particular. Which would kind of give a discount to families on the lowest incomes within those sectors. It's not a solution to the whole of the cost of living crisis, but is a measure which the government could take to kind of help people in those particular areas. And then also sort of looking at the income side of the equation, we need to look to find ways to kind of improve employment prospects, good jobs, investment, that kind of thing. But yeah, social tariffs is definitely something that we've been pushing quite heavily.
Okay. Any other observations from the panel?
I think I'd just sort of pick up on that point. When I look at the whole consumer protection landscape, we sort of look at it as a triangle in terms of you've got the three elements to it. You've got one which is consumer education, sort of consumer advice. Then you've got business education, business support, business advice, and then you've got the other point of the triangle, which is sort of legislation, regulation, market surveillance and enforcement, basically. And actually, when all those three are in balance, the system works effectively. The issue at the moment is the system is out of balance, essentially, for all the reasons that we're outlining here.
On all 3 points of the triangle?
I would say on all 3 points at the moment. I'd say that legislation is sort of catching up in terms of there's been a lot of legislation sort of recently subject to secondary legislation with the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill on online marketplaces, but regulation is starting to catch up. But then it's then down to the market surveillance and enforcement activity, as well as the other really important area, which is consumer education and consumer advice. If you sort of go back to that triangle, I always think in terms of what you need well-informed and enabled consumers, businesses and regulators, all sort of working in, not necessarily in harmony with each other, but the system itself should have a healthy tension. That means to say that consumers are protected at the end of the day. And at the moment, it's not in balance, and that's the fundamental problem. So yeah, and I would just also say that in terms of what practical things that can be done, on last week I think it was, government announced the Warm Homes Plan, that's going to be particularly targeted, so there are schemes like that. But again, it's then making sure that schemes like that don't fail like previous schemes, which have lost tens of millions of pounds. So there are some really good ideas and really good initiatives out there that will actually support the least well off. But actually the opportunity for a huge loss of public money on the back of it, if you don't have the right processes and governance in place, is the issue. And it's those sorts of things that we're particularly focused on.
Anything else on this, Mr. Aldridge?
Do you mind if I quickly just follow up on one point very quickly that John made around advice? I mean, advice is hugely important. Obviously, we believe that at Citizens Advice, both in terms of helping people to understand their rights and be confident, and also to resolve their problems. But I think one thing we haven't sort of touched on much here is from those phone calls that we get and through web chat and face-to-face, we get a huge amount of real-time frontline data, which gives us a finger on the pulse of where problems are arising and where people are experiencing most harm. And we already do a lot of work feeding that in to regulators, government and trading standards as well, including through the Consumer Protection Partnership, which trading standards are part of. And that's something we still call the advice advocacy feedback loop. So also there's a huge amount of value in advice in giving regulators and government departments who are quite removed from people that kind of insight very quickly on, okay, well, this problem's arising over here, and allow them to tackle it more quickly.
Yeah, insight into the people who pay their wages.
Is that working, that advice, advocacy feedback loop? Because that would be useful to know if it is.
Yeah, I think there are certainly examples where it works really well. So to give one example, from a couple of years ago, we were seeing when energy prices spiked, we saw a huge rise in the number of calls we were getting from people on prepayment meters for their energy, who were being forced onto them when it was inappropriate and unsafe to do so, and also couldn't afford to keep them topped up. We were able to feed that data quickly through to the regulator. Unfortunately, they didn't act quickly enough, so we did quite a vocal public intervention around that, drawing heavily on our data and the sort of real people's stories that people were telling us, as well as those numbers with some research on the scale of the problem. And then through that, we were able to put pressure on Ofgem and the government to act, and that did lead to, but unfortunately, like, we do see regulators taking too long to act often.
What is going on with this? Like, why are regulators not moving faster?
I think that's a great question, and I think it varies from regulator to regulator. I think there's a few things. One is what we sort of fed into around pressure on regulators to kind of government sort of wanting to be seen as pro-business and not putting costs on business, so sort of pressure on regulators. Also, often regulators can be quite afraid that firms will take them to court, judicially review their decisions. We see regulators being super cautious when they're bringing regulators in. It takes such a long time between organisations like Citizens Advice and Which raising an issue to regulators and government taking it seriously, and then they take a really long time to kind of gather all of the evidence that's needed, and I understand that they need evidence, and then they will come up with some draft proposals, and which they will consult on, rightly. That takes a really long time, and then eventually you'll get some regulations. There's often then a lag time for implementation, and then you've got the regulation, and frankly by that point often firms have moved and the problem's elsewhere. So at Citizens Advice we call that regulatory whack-a-mole. So by the time a regulator does this, like, it's popped up over here.
We're spending billions of pounds on regulators who are basically moving so slowly that they're useless to consumers.
I think the way that regulators are currently set up and the way that regulation works makes it very difficult for regulators to act quickly and decisively. And there's always got to be a balance with these things. But I think particularly as we've seen markets move online, and we've seen technological advancements move so quickly, like we've got AI, sort of proliferation, where we're already seeing kind of consumer protection issues around that, with people getting financial advice from AI. It's very difficult for regulators to keep up with that. And I think we can look at the types of regulation that we use. So perhaps moving more towards a principles-based way of regulation, which we've seen some move towards in financial services, is one way to get around that. So rather than having to introduce a detailed new rule and regulation to cover every single eventuality, we do still need some of those, to be clear. But if you have a principle around sort of demonstrating that you're treating your customers fairly, the regulator can use that as a way to kind of act more swiftly, perhaps.
MacKenzie.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't take issue with that broadly, the points that are being made there. And I think in terms of some of the bigger regulators, I think that those points are absolutely fair. I think in terms of trading standards, though, it is slightly different. I would say our people are effective almost all of the time,
There's just not many of them.
Well, exactly. My officers today are dealing with illegal vapes and tobacco. They're helping a local business with some complicated weights and measures stuff. There's another product sort of toy manufacturer, small toy manufacturer has been helped today. That's all effective, We've got numbers. We've got this £11 for every £1 spent, or sometimes it's a lot more than that for every £1 spent. I think our guys are effective. They're practical, pragmatic, and effective. But they can't do everything every day.
But they're also on the front line, right?
Yeah.
So they are tackling the problems in front of them.
They are. They absolutely are.
Concha, you wanted to come in?
Just some comment on something that I'm saying about the principal regulation and how that works in financial services. That is not the holy grail. I mean, we recently did a super complaint. It's a power that we have to the FCA on insurance market. And that was after we spent a long time, because the way that we approach these things is that we provide evidence. There is a lot of discussion behind the scenes to try to push them to act because we are seeing the harm. And a super complaint for us is kind of almost the last resort because it's quite a big step for us. And we have to super complain them to take serious our concerns about problems for consumers in the insurance markets. And this is despite that they have the consumer duty, that is an outcome-based regulation. So I think that we need to be careful when we are saying that having a principal regulation or outcomes-based regulation is going to give us the solution for this, because it's not always the case.
Did you want to follow up on this? And then I'm going to move on. Yes,
just in terms of trading standards and your setup, I mean, the thought of trading standards going up against Amazon and I think Suffolk's trading standards is in charge of Felixstowe. I mean, it feels very unbalanced. And is there, I'm not saying root and branch reform, but are there any recommendations where you're like, well, actually they've got the best ideas on reform in terms of, or things that will improve the structures? I mean, I know that you've lost 25% of your inspectors in the last 10 years. That's a problem. But in terms of the system and adapting to the world, who's got? Is there anywhere to look?
Yeah, as you can imagine, that's a sort of question that's at the forefront of our mind. And actually, it was 39%, not 25%. So it's. But I think we're open to the conversations around sort of looking at the system, and there's a lot of things happening in the landscape at the moment with local government reorganisation, devolution, changes to the Food Standards Agency in terms of their national food standards regulatory model, and also potential changes to police services as well. So there's some fundamental sort of big shifts in the landscape, which means we also need to adapt to make sure there is an alignment between all of those things. So you can imagine sort of intelligence particularly sitting at the heart of a lot of that, as well as the market surveillance and enforcement that comes on the back of it. So there's that side of it. There are also an opportunity, I think, to look at the duties that are sort of carried out at a local level versus the national level. That conversation is going to happen in relation to the FSA anyway, in terms of what happens in relation to the supermarkets versus smaller outlets for sort of food. And then that's also happening in the space, for example, around construction products. In terms of where's those boundaries. So absolutely there's some really important discussions that need to happen, so there is an absolute clarity on what local authority trading standards are doing. Another example would be serious and organised crime impacts. Trading standards doesn't tackle serious and organised crime, but we have to deal with the consequences of it, and it ties up a lot of our time when we want to be focused on the other stuff to create a level playing field for businesses. So I think there's lots of opportunities around that, and then within the context of local government reorganisation, there are many different models out there of how it's being delivered. And if you went down to the southwest, for example, I think there were 4 councils down there under the heart of southwest, sort of who've all combined to take a strategic approach across those
kind of
4
a
areas.
turning point now.
I think there is an opportunity now to ask some fundamental questions, and which we naturally want to do. And trading standards is, we're I think 144 years old as a profession. It's adapted a lot over that time, and it will continue to adapt. And the reason it adapts is because it's got the consumer right at the heart of what we do. Okay.
But is there anywhere now where you're like, go and read that report? That you'd recommend where the best ideas are?
Well,
somebody probably has done the running.
We may have to write one if there isn't.
I'm not saying there's a formal report, but actually there are some good models. For example, if you went down to Heart of Southwest, and I've been down there, and they do some fantastic work. It's a more strategic sort of approach. Also, if you wanted a case study, albeit a slightly different model, because the trading standards are based within the civil service, is Northern Ireland. It's a much smaller service. They've had a lot of investment in trading standards in Northern Ireland because of the border sort of protocol sort of matters. And also in Northern Ireland, I'm not saying this is the model for the rest of GB, but also they have their consumer advisors have always been based within their local authority and their trading standards teams, and the model works over there.
Very helpful. Let's just move on to the online world now. Ms. Kumar.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to change direction a little bit to the risks that people are having doing online shopping. So we've had lots of fads. We've had Ozempic, we've had Ozempic pens, which have been unlicensed injections for weight loss. We've had counterfeit products from beauty to electrical goods. We've got a number of reviews and fake reviews online, and which are making people buy certain goods, especially on social media. I think we spend around £23 billion just influenced on reviews. We've got subscriptions and lots of standards and safety issues. So I want to really have a good understanding to set the scene of what the main issues are for online shoppers. And as we started the sort of conversation with citizens' advice, so Ms. Pardoe, if you can start first.
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't done a huge amount around the safety aspect, but I know that trading standards can kind of talk about that. But in terms of the work that we've looked at, we've done a lot of work around online design tactics and how they can be used to sort of push people into making quick decisions or buying things that they might not otherwise. So that's things like those little tickers on your screen when you're looking at something that says 250 other people have looked at this today, 10 of them have put it in their basket, sort of hurry, and then also those kind of limited time only, sort of only available for an hour sort of prices. And we found that in 2023, which is when we did our research, 8.5 million people had ended up buying things that they didn't want, they didn't need, or regretted because of the way that those kind of pricing options had been presented, sort of wasting more than £270 each over the course of the year. And then another one is around sort of those subscription traps, which we have seen some action on through the DMCC, which is good. But again, I think like all of these sort of online tactics, it's a real challenge for regulators in terms of, unlike, I don't know, in the supermarket sector, you've got a limited number of supermarkets and they've got physical offices and you can sort of go in and bonk them on the head. With online, anyone can be a seller, and we've seen a huge amount of proliferation, and they can be global as well. So there is a massive question for regulators about how they can be more nimble and how we can use different types of regulation, and also education for consumers around that.
What action do you think needs to happen? What recommendations would you want to see to make consumers online and doing online shopping safer?
I mean, we'd like to see the CMA in particular, and then I'll let Rocio jump in. CMA in particular, we think, needs to take a strong role in this, and we've seen them do that, and they've got new powers through the new legislation. It'll be really interesting to see how that evolves over the next couple of years, and how those and how those work out in practice and have an impact. And then I do think consumer education needs to be part of this picture as well, because there's always going to be limits on what regulations can do, so kind of educating people about what the common pitfalls are and kind of how to avoid them.
I'm just going to ask this question because it's a difficult question. So the interim chair of the CMA is obviously a former Amazon executive. Amazon was one of the companies that was required to make a formal undertaking to do more about the threat of fake reviews. I mean, do you think that's a great credential for a chair of a CMA?
I mean, we don't tend to make a call on decisions about the personnel of the CMA. I think the proof will be in the pudding in terms of how they perform within that role. Overall, we would like to see the CMA be more active.
If I move along to...
Yeah, so we have done enormous amount of time over the years about product safety in online platforms. And we are continuously finding unsafe products. Unsafe is not that we decide that they are unsafe. No, it's that UK standards say that they are unsafe. We continuously ask the online platform, Amazon, eBay, all of them, to take them down. They take them down, they appear again. That is why we now have the PRAN Act, but that act doesn't really deliver results until it's implemented. There is a regulator in charge of safety online, which is OPSS. We recently did an exercise, and by the way, now we have AI, which also should be used by the regulators and the companies to prevent unsafe products and this kind of dark patterns practice that Anne was mentioning, to monitor and identify them. But we recently did an exercise with using AI where we found things that OPSS have already said that cannot be sold and should be recalled, like baby bags that can suffocate a baby. And we just look at the online marketplaces and found loads of them. So, and what is a little bit frustrating for us is that we have been at it for years, sending that evidence to the government. We finally have an act, but the act is nothing until the secondary legislation is in place. That secondary legislation should have been already out there for consultation. We're still waiting for it. There is a role here for regulators. There is also a role for the companies. The companies have to take responsibilities. If Amazon is putting something in the online platform, they have a responsibility to make sure that it meets UK standards. It is going to be sold to UK consumers.
Let me just bring in Sarah Edwards on this question of online safety, if I may.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm particularly just interested in exactly what you're describing. I mean, we've got high streets that are dying at the moment, and thank you very much to Trading Standards for the work that you're doing. I've got 2 vape shops in my area closed in recent weeks. So as the high street dies, we get the online giants that come in, and some of the ones that have been mentioned, we've got Amazon, TikTok, eBay, we've got Temu. Are there particular examples of companies that you can say they're the worst offenders? Because at the top of this conversation we heard that the consumer detriment to the UK is £71.2 billion. 1/10 of that, 7.1 billion, is on counterfeit goods, and we've got about 9 million people who've purchased these. So it's a huge problem. So this responsibility that we've just been talking about, where does that lie? Who are the worst? And what can be done?
I mean, it's difficult to know, to say who is the worst, because every time that we do an investigation, we find it everywhere for all of them. Because why they will comply? Because nobody's holding them to account. And actually, if they comply, they spend more money in trying to make sure that they're doing the right checks before these products are, available for sale. Why the others are not investing that money. So there is no incentive because there is no regulation. There is nobody else basically saying to them, you are going to have this huge fine unless you do this. So all of them.
And does it ordinarily it would be Trading Standards who's got to go in and look at these, or do you go into warehouses? Do you walk into Amazon warehouse and test them there, or is it mainly at the ports? Is that where that happens? Where in the process do you try and intervene?
I'll let David talk about this. He's more of an expert on that, but I would say there's a potential risk of a bit of a race to the bottom at the moment, because with new market entrants into the online marketplaces, actually who are selling cheaper, potentially more dangerous goods. If they're getting a market share as a result of that because of the cost of living crisis, then actually it forces other platforms to do the same thing, and if the mechanisms aren't in place to prevent that. So I think there is a potential risk of a race to the bottom, which this secondary legislation is really critical.
Just sorry, on Ms. Edwards' question, I mean, who is walking into the warehouses to sort out this problem?
I mean, the direct answer to your question is that most of the checks that are done will be done at ports and borders, and we've done some research on that. Remember, I think our guys really target the checks that they do. Around 45% of the products they've checked they've found to be unsafe. They've removed them from the market. Hundreds of thousands of dangerous products every year removed from the market. The problem is, this is a tiny. You're not going to test everything. Obviously, there's far too much stuff, but we're talking about a fraction of 1% of items being looked at in a very targeted way. But we could look at a lot more in a targeted way.
You better just tell us what fraction it is, then you think.
Let me give an illustration in terms of, and we don't generally talk about this sort of publicly as such because it's sort of intelligence-led sort of surveillance and inspection. But and you could go and see the Trading Standards team up in Felixstowe, for example. And it's well worth a visit. But in terms of about 40%, I think, of the UK's sort of container trade comes through Felixstowe. It's around about 4 million containers, or the equivalent of the 20-foot sort of containers. Trading Standards teams there, when I went up a couple of years ago, were looking at about 500. And it was also interesting at the time because this is when the high streets were being flooded. with the single-use disposable vapes, and so it was very obvious where things were coming into the country. Now, because it's intelligence-led and it's also trying to create frictionless trade, you've got all those sort of challenges and sort of barriers. But it's a real issue, and at the end of the day, the UK is an island, and we can protect our ports and borders. We have to get the balance right between sort of frictionless trade, but also the balance was probably wrong, and probably still is wrong, in relation to the protections that affords consumers.
0.01%.
And you said 500 odd containers at Felixstowe.
Yeah.
We've got data from 22-23 saying that 49% of those consignments that were examined contained, and so that's 250 of those containers almost.
I think
that have unsafe products in, including toys, electrical goods, and e-scooters.
Yes, and I think actually I've seen figures that are higher than that actually.
Yeah.
So the intelligence-led process is working because it's indicating that most of the things that are looked at are probably harmful in some way, shape, or form, and shouldn't be coming into the country. But so yeah, in terms of the opportunities around making sure we've got the right protections at the ports and borders, or the right level of market surveillance or intelligence to make sure that's done in a targeted way, there are opportunities that we've talked about before in relation to that.
And so I guess...
David, do you want to just comment on that one?
I mean, maybe we're going to come on to this, but there's a slightly more positive story to tell here, I think, as well, in that a lot of these problems have been identified, and there's been some good law made recently, And as mentioned there, the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill is an excellent piece of enabling legislation.
I'll ask you about that, so well done.
All right, okay, sorry, I've anticipated. Sorry.
Take the question.
No, I was basically going to ask whether or not the new laws that have been brought in, and whether the Product and Metallurgy Act of last year has given enough powers to the Secretary of State, whether you see that as being...
Well, it has, but they haven't been implemented yet, and
No.
this is the big thing. We need these to come in. They need to be, the secondary legislation that comes in needs to be extensive enough to make sure that particularly online marketplaces and other influential intermediaries in the supply chain have, very extensive and specific obligations on them. If they don't have that, then this will continue to fail in the way that colleagues have laid out. So we can't stress that highly enough. We need clarity over what the rules are, and we need clear liabilities and obligations on the range of businesses who are inputted on there.
Yes, no, please do.
It's just to sort of illustrate the point that David's making. The point is there should be no ambiguity in relation to the obligations that are placed on businesses. There is no ambiguity if you're a high street trader in terms of bricks and mortar. You know where to go to, and they're accountable and they're liable. And we need to create the similar sorts of mechanisms, albeit in a different environment. And it will just avoid situations. So we had an example before Christmas, which was where there was an advent calendar, obviously targeted at children. And that advent calendar had a craft knife in it. Now, that should never be allowed to happen. Now, eventually it was taken down. But the point is that should never happen in the first place. There shouldn't be that greyness. And that's the point about sort of no ambiguity, and that's where we need to end up on this.
So I completely agree with all of that, and the secondary legislation is key. But also that secondary legislation has to be also to evolve to new business models. So we have not been talking about AI, but you have ChatGPT. In the US, you have ChatGPT checkout. That means that you do a search, I want to buy some shoes, and then you get the shoes and you buy it in ChatGPT. You don't go to the retailer. So obviously there is another possibility there about unsafe products. So it's important that as we are implementing this legislation, that is fit for purpose for the world that is changing.
We're going to come back to that risk in a sec. Let's keep on.
I just want to go back to social media in particular. Lots more people are buying off social media platforms like on Instagram and TikTok, and therefore it becomes quite addictive. There's a lot of mental health and social isolation that comes being online, and therefore people feel like they want to use and be a part of this community now, and then they buy onto the trends that are happening. How do you think we can tackle this in a more holistic way and the addictive nature of buying constantly online? And I go with which?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. I think that this is not only about shopping; it's about the addiction in general and how social media is making you to be all the time online. And I think that this is much broader than consumer protection. But I don't really have a clear answer in terms of how we stop that.
Any other comments on that?
I think, again, we don't really have an answer to that too, and it is a really difficult one. One thing we would say is we've been pushing for a long time now to recognise that stuff that's sold through social media is the same as on the traditional e-marketplaces. You know, and so they are fulfilling a similar role, and they should have similar obligations and responsibilities and so on. And I think that's probably where we are with the PRAM framework. Again, the proof of the pudding will be the eating in terms of the secondary legislation and as to how that applies. That will do some things to help, but the addiction thing, I think, is a separate thing and a more challenging thing, I'm afraid.
Very helpful. Mr. Madders,
yes, can I just say what an excellent act it is?
Yes, congratulations on what is a widely commended legislation, expertly steered by the Minister.
Yes, I look forward to seeing the regulations. Can I just sort of ask a slightly broad question from the consumer perspective, taking your comments earlier on about second-hand cars, home improvements being the sort of the big issues. Certainly that would be my take on the main areas. Once you've given the advice and written the letters and so on, what options are left for a consumer if they remain dissatisfied?
Not a lot, honestly. I mean, we feed intelligence through to trading standards, and they can sort of build a case and take enforcement action. But at the moment, there isn't a lot that consumers can do. We can tell them what their rights are. I guess they could try to take them to small claims court, but that's very difficult for a consumer to do. In these markets, people's options are very limited, and maybe you don't want a regulator for second-hand cars, but we do think that in those markets where we see high instances of consumer problems, they're really complex. Like, I went to buy a second-hand car last week. I work on consumer policy. I was totally lost. I mean, so far it seems to work. I found a car. I did get one. But those are technical markets. Same getting a build around. I've got no idea whether what they're telling me is the truth. So, and there's huge amounts of money involved as well. So at the moment, there's just very little protection for people. And we think that there does need to be in those markets some kind of a middle ground, whether that's kind of, and it might look different in different markets as well. But I think for us, the sort of cornerstones are kind of some kind of a register for people, whether that's licensing or sort of registering, like where people can kind of go and see whether someone's signed up to this or not. At the moment, those tend to be voluntary. Some kind of alternative dispute resolution. People need access to advice, and we also need to see an investment in enforcement in areas like trading standards. In those markets, people are so exposed to harm, and we see a huge amount. I mean, it could be like hundreds of thousands on home renovations. So,
could I just ask the other panel members whether they think some sort of ADR scheme sort of standards to be applied would be a step forward in this market, on these markets?
Yeah, I think we'd probably be in broad agreement, because I think the most important thing is that the consumer sees where their complaint goes or the issue goes, and they get some form of feedback and they can see that it's actually resolved. I think at the moment there's a risk of things not being resolved because of all the different sort of issues in the system. I think the key is then consistency relative to the risk to the consumer. So when you're talking about sort of home improvement and sort of second-hand car sales, we would advocate there that you need sort of both in terms of strong assurance accreditation alongside really strong redress systems, and obviously CTSI are involved in a consumer code scheme which came across from the OFT a number of years ago, those types of things. But then also for maybe slightly lower risk alternative dispute resolution, ombudsman services, and making sure the consumers know where to go. Obviously they've got the recourse to the courts, but we know the courts can take years. So I think it's making sure you've got these alternative routes to redress, as well as also promoting, some of the other schemes that are out there that are online, not necessarily connected to these, but things like Resolver and other mechanisms, which can all be successful. So it's a more complex landscape, but the most important thing is the consumer feels they've got that route to redress, and they will get success.
And in terms of your involvement in particular, I think home improvements is probably the one I certainly on a constituency basis had the most involvement with trading standards. What sort of proportion of those cases are you able to actually take on?
Quite a low proportion, if I'm being honest. It'll tend to, the way we do it in my own authority is we look at every complaint that comes in through the advice service. There's Advice Direct Scotland do it in Scotland, same as Citizens Advice do in England and Wales. We look at everything. If there's evidence of criminal offences, we'll investigate that. But if it's breach of contract and it's civil, there'll need to be a pattern before we're able to put any resources into it. So it would only, if it's not a pattern, if it's isolated, then that's very unlikely that we're going to have any kind of resources to go near that at the moment. Hence the need for comprehensive ADR.
And if you've got a builder who is doing this on a regular basis, but is doing it across different local authority areas, how easy is it to spot that pattern?
I think that's one thing we're quite good at. We share intelligence, intelligence with a capital I. We've sort of copied what the police do on that to a degree, and we do share information through our networks quite well. So I think the information comes back and forth. In terms of dealing with a case like that, it can be more difficult, but yeah, it can certainly be done. National Trading Standards, if it's big enough, might pick it up. Trading Standards Scotland in Scotland. So I think we're not bad. We're not bad at that. Could be better. Be good to do more. But again, it has to be at scale. It has to be at scale. And what none of those cases will touch on is, the complaints about businesses' disputes that they really, it's rare for that business, but it's just as serious for that consumer because they're in dispute and they feel they're owed money in that situation. Hence, back to this point about enforcement has to work with ADR. The two things need to be there for the landscape to work effectively.
You're going to come in?
Just on an ADR, not all ADR works.
My next question.
Yeah. So, for example, on aviation, you have ADR. You have different providers of ADR, and it's voluntary. So, obviously, the back actors will never be using ADR. So, in areas, for example, like home improvement, like aviation, for example, what you need is one ADR, and it has to be mandatory.
Sorry, John, did you want to come in again?
Yes, I was just going to sort of reiterate a point on the home improvement side, which was just something a point I mentioned earlier actually, but it's sort of linked, is making sure we're aware of the wider systemic issues, which is why there needs to be the right investment at the right level, because if you've got the government investing in warm homes plan at the one end, actually we've got a lack of a skilled workforce, we know that, and so therefore that creates the opportunity for rogue traders. The demand is there because it's been stimulated by the funding, and so therefore we know there's going to be a problem, and therefore there needs to be the mechanism to make sure that can be, the market surveillance and the enforcement activity can prevent it. Otherwise we end up in exactly the same system that we were in several years ago.
Okay. Just on the overall sort of picture then, where are the biggest gaps in enforcement as you see them at the moment?
I think we've probably talked about it already in terms of where we've got some of the biggest risks is online marketplaces, and that's where we need to see the secondary legislations that are coming through, because I think that will have a huge impact actually. I think in terms of the other illustration was around sort of the home improvement, home retrofitting space. And we see those within the Consumer Detriment Survey. They're coming out as the top factors. Second-hand car sales is another one. And that doesn't mean to say that legislation is the answer to all of those. These voluntary schemes are also the solutions.
Probably, what I was actually getting at was where are the gaps between you rather than the sectors?
So I think there's an obvious one in terms of the system, in terms of a consumer reports something through to citizens' advice, the way that's then collated. David's explained actually. Then what happens when that comes through to trading standards, and so we end up with those sort of gaps in the system, and therefore is that an effective system for the consumer? And the answer would probably no, it's not as effective as it needs to be.
I mean, I think the other thing I'd say is we can't meet all the demands on our consumer helpline, so we take all of the calls that we can with the resources that we have, but there are calls that we don't answer. So, I mean, I think the whole sector is underinvested in, and I think like particularly in those sort of unregulated sectors, so you sort of, I mean, there are problems within those essential services markets where we have regulators, of course there are within energy, water, telecoms, but outside of those it's just completely, it's almost people are sort of left to their own devices, and like citizens' advice, which training standards we do our best, but it's chronically, it doesn't get much attention and it's very underinvested in.
May not.
Yeah, just running with that. So I was doing a little kind of comparison with other countries. So various other countries, Australia, Nordics, have got a super ombudsman rather than sectoral, tiny little sectoral ones which are kind of funded by their own sector, which makes it very hard for them to go up against their sector. They can take things directly to court. They've got real teeth. They are better funded. Is that something that you're interested in the UK taking on? What are the barriers to doing that?
I mean, that's a really interesting and useful model to think about. I mean, I don't know that we haven't done any research to kind of understand how effective that is. I mean, certainly like full-blown legal ombudsman is certainly the gold standard for us in terms of ADR. And in terms of like when I think it works best, so in energy, where we're the statutory advice provider for consumers, we take calls from consumers and we are able to, where appropriately, directly refer them through to Ombudsman Service, and we also have direct referral routes through to energy suppliers with specialist teams, and we don't do a direct referral route of consumers through, but we kind of are able to feed our intelligence directly back to the regulator, how responsive they are. They have got more responsive since we did the prepayment meter work, I must admit. So I think like Ombudsman is definitely the gold standard. Whether you can have that model in an unregulated sector, sort of question mark, but I definitely agree that it has to be mandatory, otherwise it's not worth it, because otherwise those firms who are sort of trying to do the right thing in general, those sort of good apples are going to be part of that scheme and use that to sort of advertise and give people that sort of peace of mind, but you're never going to get those kind of bad apples. And also you need to get people to a stage where they're kind of like, when they're shopping around, they're looking, is this a member of an ADR scheme? And we are like a long way from there.
Yeah. And John?
Yeah, I'm broadly supportive actually, and we've been saying this, that actually there needs to be a rationalisation, because essentially whether it's Ombudsman, ADR, it's just consumer redress at the end of the day, and it just needs to be simple. So I think there's an opportunity to make it simpler. Now, whether that's rationalisation or whether it's one, I think those questions need to be asked, and I think that's the opportunity. I think where another country that's gone with a single consumer ombudsman is Belgium as well. So there are models out there of where it can be done. Now, we may be on a different scale and it may need to be looked at sort of slightly differently, but I think the key point is it probably can be simpler. And if you look at consumer awareness of redress schemes, ombudsman is a generally sort of well-known sort of title in terms of people know what it sort of does. But actually some of the research on ADR, there's about a 5% level awareness of what ADR is. Now, there is an argument to say that consumers don't need to know about it until they need it, but actually just that level of consumer awareness to know they've got the redress when they need it is a key.
I agree with that, but something that we know doesn't work is having different ADRs in one sector, and this is aviation. So what happens is, this is where competition actually doesn't work, because what you have is competition, and you as a company have a choice. You can choose this one and this one. Which one you're going to choose? The ones that are nicer to the businesses. That is not a right model. Whether we need one for the whole economy is a separate thing that actually.
Okay. And if I may, just from the CMA, and coming back to the conversation we were having earlier, I mean, I've just been looking at the CMA's strategic steer back in May last year, which is delivering investment, consumer benefit and economic growth using tools proportionately with growth and investment in mind. I mean, it couldn't be kind of stronger messaging, basically saying please sit on your hands and do nothing, particularly if you're talking about taking on big companies. And in November they came out with the first firms being investigated on the DMCCA, which has got the real teeth. And what's notable is they're not exactly the big scary targets. And the weird one is the secondary ticketing sites. I mean, we've been looking into Ticketmaster and Live Nation. No, they're not looking at Ticketmaster and Live Nation. They're looking at the competitor of Ticketmaster and Live Nation only, which is StubHub and Viagogo, owned by Eric Baker, I think. And I mean, I don't know him from Adam, but it's just weird that after the Oasis stuff that we're going after the opposite. So what do you think the CMA should be doing under a new chair in terms of, please give some recommendations as to if we're going to have a functional CMA which is really going after people in a hurry, so we are helping consumers, what should they be doing, Rocio?
Yeah, I will answer that question, but before that I can have a clarification on the secondary market.
Right.
And Ticketmaster, they look at the Ticketmaster and Oasis, and they provide, they were undertakings on that. We think that they could have gone further, but they look at this. Secondary ticketing is a market that is not working, so it's a separate issue. And actually the government have agreed with that, and they, what we need is basically this legislation in the King's Speech to get that in. And then you refer to the investigations that they announced in November. As you say, they went for things that are definitely illegal, if that makes sense. So they didn't take a lot of risks on things that you need to do more work in particular, for example, reference prices and these sort of things where you need you will be taking more risk. We will like them to take more risk. And by risk, I mean looking for these places where there is evidence and actually go after these businesses that they are having these bad practices. But as I said, at the moment, it's not the message that they are getting from the government. So regulators need to feel that the government are supportive of them actually delivering their duty. Yeah. And in the case of the CMA, is competition and consumer protection.
What about just asking the CMA to publish things like, okay, well, we're looking into market studies, so just trying to, those are investigations that they published. What about kind of asking for information on lower level things just to see what they're doing? Because at the moment we only see the odd investigation list, but we don't have any other information about what they're doing. And it's like, well, are you doing anything? Is the thing that we all want comfort on. Would that be helpful?
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think certainly more transparency, but I definitely echo what was said around we do need that clear steer from government to regulators that when they take action, that's going to be welcomed. We're seeing a lot of language, quite strong language from the government and sort of towards business. I think the Chancellor even said she's going to put her foot on the neck of regulators to make sure that they weren't over-regulating. And I think that the language around sort of like growth and regulation is a little bit simplistic. And again, I sort of echo what Rocio said earlier around without consumer confidence, we're not going to get growth, or we're definitely not going to get the type of growth that we need that's going to lead to improvement in living standards. What people need is the type of growth that makes them have more money in their pockets, invest in their communities. And within markets, we need people to be confident enough to spend. And if we don't have that, and regulation is a crucial part of delivering that consumer confidence. So yes, the CMA, it'd be great to have more transparency around that, and along with all of the other regulators, see them move more quickly when there is emerging evidence of consumer harm. But I think overall, regulators just need the confidence to that when they take action, that's going to be kind of welcomed.
Given what the government is stating, and you're an economist, do you believe that they understand the laws of economics and competition? Because, I mean, their actions are exactly the opposite.
Well, I sometimes have doubts that is the case, because I think that, as Anne was saying, it's too simplistic to say that there is a trade-off here about, for example, consumer protection and growth, because they forget that markets have a demand side, and the demand side have to feel confident to engage in the market, and for that you need the right regulation. By the way, not any regulation have to be the right regulation. Bad regulation is bad for consumers as well. It's not only for businesses. And on competition, it's not a brainer. More competition deliver more growth. So sometimes when I see some of the narrative from the government about this, it doesn't make sense economically. It doesn't.
John, David, any observations on whether the CMA is in full use of its powers at the moment? Is it pulling its punches?
Briefly take you back to your previous question, which was what do we think the CMA should do? I think the cases they've opened up are good cases. I welcome them. What do we think they should do? Make full use of the new powers from the new Act.
It's too early to judge whether they are. Is that
yes,
true?
I think, well,
April last year. Yeah.
No. So this is.
I would say it's in its early days. We'd want them to make full use of those powers in an effective way that benefits consumers, and to focus on the big players.
You're not telling us that what you've seen in the first year is a muscular use of those powers.
I'm not saying it is, and I'm not saying it isn't. Can I make another point here? Sorry. I think what's often overlooked with this is there is a second piece of the jigsaw here. And under the new Act, Trading Standards were given significant extra powers too. Now, we can't directly impose the fines and the other penalties, but we can go to court for them in a much stronger position from when we were before. So it seems to us that the CMA needs to be dealing with all the big national players, and we're dealing with the regional and local players, and both things need to happen in order for the market to work properly for consumers. There's all the resourcing problems that we talked about earlier, but we're still really, keen to use these powers. And, I think for a modest investment into trading standards, there's a potential for a very significant return on that in that context.
We're slightly over time, but I just want to wrap up with a quick view of the future with Mr. Aldridge.
Some of you have already mentioned some of the things around consumer protection issues relating to artificial intelligence. I'm sure there are a number of issues that might be coming over the hill in the next 5 to 10 years. AI is already here. Could you quickly summarise some of that for us?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think for us, in terms of horizon scanning, the thing we're focusing most on is AI. It's just an entirely new thing for regulators to get their head around. We're already seeing the harm, so around people seeking financial advice online, new, even cleverer forms of scams. And we know that actually a number of regulators, for example, the FCA and Ofcom, are already doing some work thinking around that, and we're engaging them around it. That's definitely like a huge challenge that we're going to overcome. And before I just wanted to quickly flag, we're actually have commissioned we're doing some work around AI, but we've also just about to put some research into the field around second-hand cars and home improvements, which we will should have results back fairly soon, and I'll share them with the committee once we've got them.
So just to add to one said on AI, I don't think this is the next 5 to 10 years. It's now. We need to start thinking now. And also, if you think about from the time that you start thinking about what regulations you have until you have loads of years, 5, 6, 7 years. So what we want to see is the regulators already thinking about what could happen. And you don't need to be in science fiction, because this technology already exists. I mentioned before the ChatGPT checkout that is already available in the US. Well, then we need to make sure that any regulations about safety actually also cover this kind of business models. We are seeing scams, deepfake are already here. So obviously on the Online Safety Act have to cover that, and Ofcom have said that it does, so you can cover for that kind of situation. But then we have agentic, which is, this is a year of agentic, and people talk about these agents that will be used by consumers. We don't know if consumers will be using this or not. We don't know how many consumers will use it. We don't know when, if they will go. But the technology is already there. So you can already imagine if there is an agent providing financial services advice, for example, are they covered for the current regulation? And that is the type of work that the FCA, I hope that they are doing in terms of the call for there is a review. But also in e-commerce, if you have an agent that is going to, actually you are going to use for consumers to buy the things for you, and you will give that agent also a lot of personal information. What does that mean for the regulations that we have in place at the moment? Where are the gaps? Are they fit for purpose? So what we want is to see the regulators actively looking at this and having a proper debate about this, this scenario, and continue evolving because the technology is moving fast.
Okay, David, John, anything quick to add?
Yeah, quickly, three themes for us. One, threat, two, opportunities. The threat is, it's already been touched on, deep fakes, all sorts of false images and videos and all that kind of things, enabling scammers to be, to scam people in new and different ways. And we're already seeing that, and we've got to try and tackle that, and the regulators have got to try and tackle that. First opportunity is, like everyone in the world really, an opportunity for us to do our job better, to investigate more cleverly, to be more efficient, all that kind of stuff. We're already actively looking at some stuff. Some stuff's been trialled on that, so really quite interested in that. Second opportunity, something that's not talked about so much, I don't think, and it seems to us there's a real opportunity for businesses to use, especially small businesses that we deal with all the time, to use AI to reduce the time that they spend on compliance, and so that they can spend most of their time buying and selling, doing the things that they're good at. It's a real opportunity perhaps for them to improve their compliance and also to reduce the time spent on it. So really exciting opportunities there, I think, for businesses, and we're already starting to talk to businesses directly about that sort of thing. So like every technological advantage change, it brings its pluses and its minuses, doesn't it? And it's not going away, so we have to deal with it.
Okay, that's been a really good session. You've basically told us that prices are rocketing, but there's a £70 billion bill for consumer harm on top of that. Online risk is proliferating in those marketplaces that account for about a third of retail spending. Surveillance is tiny. Enforcement is underfinanced. We're spending billions of pounds on regulators who aren't moving fast enough to solve problems. Alternative dispute resolution is almost non-existent, and it's very complicated. It's not clear the CMA is using its full powers, and AI is about to make it much worse. So that is a very good kind of summary for us as a committee to get stuck into, and we will start that when we have pre-appointment hearings with the CMA chair in a couple of weeks' time. But for now, that's it. Order, order.